Today I want to talk, as has been indicated, about the 80s and the 90s. And although prophecy is not something which has been given to the Jewish people since the destruction of the Second Temple, fools and sociologists do engage in prophecy. So something of what I want to say today refers to the future. But frankly, I think if we get a clear enough picture of what the present is like, the future speaks for itself. Let me, in spite of Peter Medding's review of some of the things that I've said the last two lectures, give us a sort of quick up to speed to where we are. By the last 2 decades of this century, those who worry about Jewish life in America are no longer overwhelmingly concerned about successful Jewish acculturation. We've done that. Anti-Semitism, or even matters of dual loyalty. That was so much on the mind of American Jewry during the first half of the post-war era. In part, these concerns had largely evaporated because America had changed just as much as Jews had. By the late 70s, America had moved away from the melting pot ideal, where everyone was supposed to be alike, and had given way to what I called last week in the question and answer period, the salad bowl America, that legitimated an increasingly pluralist national character. The civil rights revolution of the 60s and the emergence of ethnicity in the 70s as an American ideal had made this country recognize that there was not simply one America, but many. In this sort of multi-complexioned, multi-ethnic America, there could be no questions about the legitimacy of Jewish belonging, nor any sanction for organized anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism simply became anti-American. Even as support for Israel grew among American Jews in the aftermaths of the 1967 and 73 wars, the question of dual loyalty seemed absurd in the context of ethnic diversity. If Jews were to be accused of dual loyalties, then so were Hispanics, African Americans, Poles, Irish, Italians, and all the other ethnic groups who were now allowed to celebrate their cultural diversity and attachments to a mother country or church. In the United States of the 80s and the 90s, ethnic identity and religious identification have become in large part expected norms of individual identification. To be an unhyphenated American today is really the exception rather than the rule. Moreover, as this ethnic heritage became a part of the American scene, some Jewish symbols had become American symbols too. Everyone in America seemed to know what a bar mitzvah was. This Jewish coming of age was now a part of the American teen experience, no less a part of the national experience than, say, a kosher dill pickle or a bagel. Not only were Hanukkah menorahs appearing on city malls along with Christmas creches, but on the mall in the nation's capital, on land donated by the federal government, a Holocaust memorial and museum has been built alongside the other symbols of the American civil religion and national heritage. And I think what we've witnessed, in fact, this very week, is, for better or for worse, and it's a whole nother subject that we could talk about at another time, the Americanization of the Holocaust experience and of the Holocaust memorialization. Yet in this American, ethnic America, there remained residues of the melting pot ideal. They were embedded in the notion that while America allowed for ethnic, racial, religious, and cultural diversity, these differences were not supposed to be significant or essential. More precisely, you could be an ethnic in America, you could be religious in America, you could even be different in America. But that difference, that ethnicity, that religion was expected not to intrude on the basic underlying common culture of Americanism, which was washed over all of us. It was not really supposed to foster a separate and parochial existence. Indeed, as sociologist Richard Alba has recently demonstrated, these ethnic elements are not sufficiently substantive in everyday life to even hinder intermarriage in white America. American Jews are allowed to be Jewish so long as their Jewishness remains symbolic, largely symbolic, and is not so significant as to make them parochial and distinct. Exactly where ethnicity becomes significant, or where the line between too strong an attachment to ethnic or religious differences would be, was something, of course, contested throughout the 80s and into the current decade. Whether the debate was about intermarriage, is it okay? Is it good for the Jews? Is it bad for the Jews? Is it American? After all, intermarriage is an expression of an American ideal, integration. Cultural integration in general, good or bad. Bilingual education, right or wrong. Civil rights for homosexuals or public support for parochial schools. At the heart of all of these debates was the question of how different someone could be or wanted to be and still claim to be fully integrated into America. Could you be a Hasidic Jew wearing an earlocks, a beard, a black hat, and still be an American? This debate was not an academic one for American Jewry. For those who saw the American tolerance for pluralism as symbolic and limited, Judaism and Jewish expression would also have to be limited. You can be Jewish, but not too Jewish. You can be different, but not too different. In a way, those Jews for whom heritage, culture, that Jewish American, hyphenated American who was more American than Jewish that I've spoken about in the past, had become the essence of their Judaism. And that could be more comfortable than anything in America. That symbolic Jewish Americanism, American Judaism, made it easier for the meaning of being Jewish to be far less substantive. On the other hand, for those who were convinced that America was really open, that when Americans talked about ethnic diversity, they really meant it, that when Americans said you could be all sorts of different versions of a parochial identity and still be part of America, and believed that America didn't demand just a superficial difference, but allowed you to be as different as you wanted to be. Those people saw the possibilities for an active and open expression of Jewish lifestyle and celebration of traditions and Jewish uniqueness in the midst of American identity. They saw this new America as providing them with new opportunities to be Jewish, unparalleled in the diaspora experience, that you could wear a yarmulke and do anything you wanted to. You could be the assistant to the Speaker of the House of Representatives, as indeed Ari Weiss was for many years when Tip O'Neill was the Speaker of the House of Representatives, and wear a yarmulke and be as much a part of America and as uncompromisingly Jewish as you chose. So, in a sense, these two kinds of Jews about which I've spoken in the past were really testing Americans' commitment to pluralism, to ethnic diversity, and to an open society, to see how much America would tolerate in their choices and how much the Jews would tolerate in their Jewish choices. Those I've called Jewish heritage Jews, the great Jewish majority of America, continued throughout the 80s and into this decade to demonstrate by their actions that, frankly, they didn't trust America, that they believed that America would only tolerate a symbolic and therefore attenuated or even a diluted Judaism. Theirs continued to be a kind of cultural Judaism, a much more open yet more ambiguous and less binding parameter for defining a group. And so while many of these Jews continued proudly to identify themselves as Jewish, theirs has often been a commitment without much content. These are the Jews who in the latest surveys claim they believe being Jewish is important or very important. 87% of the Jews in the latest surveys said that being Jewish is important or very important. They attend the synagogue at least once a year, 88% of them. They may give to a Jewish charity, 59% of them. They have persisted in patterns set in the previous decade of at most celebrating a few rites of passage, most of which are generally bereft of a Jewish or a specifically Jewish content, even though they are nominally Jewish. Thus, there are bar mitzvahs or bat mitzvahs. 55% of the people claim to have celebrated a bar or bat mitzvah that are little more than parties. Jewish weddings that have a rabbi officiating, but little else of Jewish content. Or Jewish funerals that lack most, if any, of the specific Judaic rites associated with death and mourning. Large numbers of these Jews light Hanukkah candles, though commonly without consistency, Or, as I've said, they attend a Seder, although one which is hardly different from the Thanksgiving gathering. They get some Jewish education, but it's increasingly shallow and always limited to the primary school years. They go to the synagogue a few times a year, although more so the older than the younger generations. They may attend a high holiday service. Although sentimentally pro-Israel, they're not particularly active for or connected to Israel, and they know little about it, while most, especially the young, have still never visited there. They insist on recalling the Holocaust, but they're not sure what lessons to learn from it. For all of their limitations, these practices seem firmly established as a sufficient minimum for asserting Jewish heritage. Yet even these that I've just mentioned are not universally practiced. And so, for example, the 1990 National Jewish Population Survey, which is really going to serve as the basis for much of what I'm going to be talking about this evening, which is a kind of report on the current state of American Jewry for all of its methodological problems, and I'm sure there are those out there who recognize, as I do, that it isn't a perfect survey, found that about 14% of those who were fully Jewish, by that I mean either born Jewish or converted to it, did not attend a Seder of any sort. 38% among those who were in mixed marriages. About 40% didn't attend the synagogue on high holidays or fast on Yom Kippur. And about 23% of those entirely Jewish admitted that no one in their household ever lights Hanukkah candles. 15% of this same population never celebrated a bar mitzvah. And even the relatively modest involvement of subscribing to a Jewish periodical, I mean, what does that take? Was only true for 28% of those who identified as Jews. What about the harder practices? That was the easy stuff. The harder practices, those, what do I mean by harder practices? Those that require a commitment of a greater commitment of time, money, or religious and ethnic energy. The numbers were even starker. Again, looking only at those that were born Jews or converted to Judaism. About 38% didn't contribute to a Jewish charity in 1989. 66% never lit Sabbath candles. 89% did not attend the synagogue weekly. Only 45% claimed that most or all of their friends were Jewish. And of the 859,000 children under the age of 18 in what is called this core Jewish population, only about 400,000 of them were in the Jewish educational system at the end of the 80s. And most of those, as I've said before, were in supplementary education, that is, in non-intensive Jewish education. And yet, in spite of this low level of activity among the great majority of these Jews, 87% of those who were born Jewish or converts to it claimed by the end of the 80s that being Jewish was important in their lives, with about 60% of those saying it was very important. So what does it mean that it's important in their lives? As Nathan Glazer has correctly argued, the fact that today's American Jews are less embarrassed about their Jewish identity, that they say it's important to them to be Jewish, doesn't mean that that identity is a very weighty one or exercises great influence over their behavior. They may say it's important, but I don't know what that means anymore. Indeed, as Stephen Cohen, my colleague, found during this same period, almost half the non-Jews he surveyed also said that religion was very important in their own lives. After all, we're the country that says, "In God we trust," on our coins. We're a very religious people, though it's sometimes hard to see how. So what does it mean to these Jews, to be Jewish in America? When asked in the 1990 survey to answer this question, more of those who identified themselves as Jews said it was, well, a cultural group. 70% said that. Or an ethnic group. 57% said that. Rather than a religious group. 49% said that. In an April 3rd column of this year, New York Times reporter Peter Steinfels, who found this kind of religion typical of many Americans of all faiths, quotes a Richard Shapiro, who personifies this kind of Jew. Reflecting on his Judaism, Shapiro says, "What's religion? I don't know. It's some sort of connection to yourself and your family and your past. Jews seem to have this burden of something going back in time. That's it. That's what made it into the New York Times. It is a cultural burden Shapiro, like other Jewish heritage Jews, are willing to bear because, as he continued, it provides something to touch base with. Both culture and ethnicity require less activity and fewer observances, are less specific than religion. As for the obvious absence of a strong commitment to Jewish practice, 90% of American Jews in the same 1988 Cohen survey thought a Jew could be religious even if he isn't very observant. In fact, 2/3 of them were so open and pluralist in their religion that they declared that they were offended by rabbis who told them how to live their Jewish life. Nevertheless, these were Jews who had come to terms with their way of being Jewish. About 79% of American Jews considered themselves to be, quote, very good Jews. And 2/3 said that they were committed to Jewish continuity. Yet perhaps what is most striking is the conclusion that 2/3 reached, that being Jewish did not make them any different from other Americans. Without question, the period of the 70s, and even more so the 1980s, a time when less and less of the life of American Jews was derived from Jewish history, experience, culture, and religion, and more of it was derived from the current and existing realities of American culture, American politics, and the general American religion, highlighted the divergencies among American Jews. So in the end, these Jews, so proud of their heritage and so flexible with it, were Jews whose Judaism turned out to be their way of being Americans. On the other hand, there are Jews for whom the most involved Judaism, the most creative Judaism, the most worthwhile Judaism is the Judaism of activity. For some, this has meant the intensification of Jewish education, particularly in the explosion of those attending day schools, who now make up approximately 1/3 of those in the Jewish educational system. These are the people I've spoken about a great deal already in the course of these lectures. These Jewish Jews, if we will, the more actively Jewish Jews, are committed in more visible ways, including rediscoveries of their Jewish identity. These are the Jews that account for another important aspect of life in the 80s and the 90s. In these last 20 years or less, we have trained more rabbis, consumed more kosher food, published more Jewish books, produced more Jewish plays, taught more children intensively than at any time in the Jewish past. This is also a period of time when, as I mentioned last time, that the General Assembly of the Jewish Federations, what I call the high holiday of Jewish institutional life, was essentially defined by sessions of study of Torah. This is an extraordinary turnabout in the intensive Jewish life in America. And this has also been a period of time when Jews have begun in America to focus increasingly on Jewish survival. But frankly, I think it's important to remind ourselves that Jewish survival is not in question. It's not simply of whether or not there will be Jews in America. Most demographers now agree that people who call themselves Jews, although shrinking in numbers, will continue to be part of an American life for the foreseeable future. But what the character of that Jewish identity will be is in question. So the question of survival is not whether Jews as a people or an ethnic group will survive in America, but as my colleague Calvin Goldscheider has put it, which segments of the Jews will survive? Or put differently, as we come to the end of the 20th century, We wonder not so much about the survival of Jews in America, but of the survival of Judaism in America. And allied to that central question are the questions that so concern us, we who study Jews. What the character of that Judaism will be. Certain facts are undeniable. We can predict them with fair degrees of certainty. The two types of Jews that exist are not equal in number, nor is the imbalance likely to change in the years ahead. There's not going to be a great explosion of actively Jewish Jews. It's not going to happen. Many of them have continued, even though these actively Jewish Jews have shrunk in number. Many of them have continued to set the agenda and determine the direction of Jewish life here. The question, however, however, is whether the few can continue to exert influence as their resources decline. Put differently, in the matter of survival of American Judaism, can we depend on the quality of Jewish life, high though it may be in certain quarters, to assure the survival of Judaism if we don't have the quantity? To answer that question, we could go about it in a whole variety of ways. But I want to look at 6 specific areas of Jewish life in America and ask the question in all of them, can we have quality if we don't have quantity? And what will the nature of that quality be? Those 6 areas are the demography of the Jews, or population growth and fertility. How many will we be? How many are we? Generational variation. How are the young people going to be different from the old people? And are there going to be enough young people? Residential patterns, where and with whom Jews live and are likely to continue to live. Marital patterns, Jewish identity, and Jewish institutional life, including Jewish education. So let's start with talking about counting. How many are we? The 1990 data says that there are 4.2 million born Jews who now identify themselves as Jews, 185,000 Jews by choice, that is converts of one sort or another. I'm not asking how they got converted, but they're in, as far as they're concerned. And 1.1 million Jews who were born as Jews, but claim when asked, what is your current religion, they say none. And that group is heavily weighted with young people. This makes up what the Jewish population survey called core Jews of about 5.5 million. If we compare this number with those in 1970, just 20 years ago, there were 5.4 million of people who more or less qualified by these same characteristics. I'm going to talk about a growth rate, even though you'd say from 5.5 to 5.4 doesn't sound like growth. In fact, the numbers are not exact because not the same questions were asked in 1970. The argument is that the growth rate in American Jewry has been 1.8% in the last 20 years. That's strikingly smaller than a 22.4% overall American growth rate during the same period. In addition, we have 210,000 born or raised Jews, but converted out. So the good news is that there isn't a lot of conversion out of Judaism. People just sort of stop, but conversion is not something that's happening to the Jews. There are 415,000 of Jewish parentage who are identified with another religion now. This is a problematic number in the survey. I don't want to get into the problems here. It really is a more esoteric discussion that we need to go into now. There are 701,000 children under the age of 18 who have qualified Jewish parentage but were not raised as Jews. This is also a problematic figure in the survey. About 40% of those people actually have a parent who was born Jewish. And here is one figure that I find perhaps the most striking of all. There are 1.35 million Gentile adults in households that had a Jew in it. Meaning that somehow in the Jewish community now, in the Jewish household, there is almost 1.5 million people who in no way identify themselves or can be identified as Jews. It is no longer possible, then, to count Jews in America without counting Gentiles or non-Jews, and without counting those whose affiliation with and identification as Jews is open to question. And that means that as of this moment, the notion of a distinct Jewish community is far more difficult to support demographically than at any time in American Jewish history. Maybe to put this more graphically, there's no Jew, or very few Jews in America, who can sit down with their entire family around a table and say there's nobody around this table who's a Gentile. Everyone, everywhere, somehow there is within the Jewish community, the lines are blurred. And one of the things that we've discovered is that even when those non-Jews are part of the American Jewish community, the American Jews who marry non-Jews don't cut themselves off from the rest of the Jewish community. And so now the non-Jewish American world and the Jewish American world are very much inextricably linked together. Jews are increasingly less likely to vary demographically from American non-Jews. Jews are very much like white Americans. In part, this is a product of the fact that 9 out of 10 Jews in America today are born here. And half are at least 2 generations removed from the immigrant experience. And you recall, I hope, from the previous lectures, that one of the most important aspects of Jewish growth in America, and in part the Jewish cultural experience in America, has been the immigrant experience. Well, by and large, that's over. And the few Jewish immigrants who are now coming to America, unlike all of those immigrants who came in the past, are not religiously active. Not to say that all immigrants in the past were religiously active, but immigrants today, by and large, the immigrants who are coming from the former Soviet Union or Israel, are not Jewishly active when they come to America. What about fertility? Well, I already told you in the past, Jews did not take a large part in the baby boom, and they've been going downhill ever since. By the end of the childbearing age years at age 45, Jewish women exceeded replacement levels only among those who became mothers during the baby boom years. That means that all other Jewish mothers since the baby boom years have not been exceeding replacement level, which is 2 children per family. And I think I mentioned it in here before, it's worthwhile recalling that it's likely by the end of this century, or very soon thereafter, Israeli Jewry will outnumber American Jewry. And that's not because they've been so fertile, but it's because we've had a great deal of leakage. Is it thus any wonder that, as was the case with Look magazine in 1964, you remember we talked about the article about the vanishing American Jew. It turns out in 1992, there was another magazine that published a story called America's Vanishing Jews. But this piece was in an Israeli publication, the Jerusalem Report. So, in fact, the change, the disappearance of American Jewry is once again on the agenda. Now, we've talked about 2 types of Jews. How do we look at fertility in these 2 types of Jews, the passive, if you will, the heritage Jews and the active Jews? Population figures don't distinguish among those actively Jewish and those not. Nevertheless, the sweep of the numbers suggests that low birth rates are not only the norms for most of Jewry, but beyond that, the indications are that being Jewish seems to lead to smaller household size. While the 867,000 mixed households in the sample, that is, where at least one member of the family is a non-Jew, had an average size of 3.2 people, entirely Jewish households, which made up about 57% of the sample, had only 2.2 persons per household, a cost of 1 child per family. So how's this for good news? The good news is that if you have a mixed marriage, you're going to have more kids. But of course, if you're going to have more kids who are not Jewish, is that good news or is it bad news for the Jews? It's very complicated. The major sources of higher fertility ideals and larger family size are among the self-segregated religious Jews in a few metropolitan areas in the United States. But as you'll see, if time allows, if we talk about essentially Orthodox Jewry, who seems to be the great repository of high fertility among American Jewry, they are in big trouble too. And we'll talk about them perhaps later. Now, the question is, do numbers count? Does it matter if we don't have that many? After all, who says that quantity is so important? Maybe if we have high quality, concentrated Jewry, then we're okay. We just need a small group of dedicated Jews and everything will be all right. Well, obviously there's a problem with that. Just to give a small example from the business that we talked about last time of the economics. While Jews, as they've made it into America, have begun to give more and more money to general causes, the general causes, or the outside world, hasn't given more and more money to Jewish causes. That means that Jewish needs, while they may grow, because why do they grow? If you have a shrinking base, you build lots of institutions, which Jews have done in the last 40 years. Jews have built enormous numbers of institutions. Institutions cost money. If you have fewer people supporting those institutions, the institutions don't cost less, they cost more. And no one else is supporting those institutions, then from a purely economic grounds, we can say that you can't have high quality if you can't support the high quality institutions. And who will support the high quality institutions? Only those who recognize the importance of those institutions. That is, those who are actively Jewish. Well, that's a shrinking base. If you were running a business this way, you'd say, we've got to expand our base. We've got to find new markets. But Jews don't do that. We're not in the proselytizing business. We don't missionize. We don't increase our numbers that way. And we obviously haven't been increasing them by means of fertility. So purely from an economic basis, and economically Jews, although I think I pointed this out, I don't remember if I said it here, I've said it in one of the other lectures I've spoken to during the course of my visit here, but the fact is that while Jews are better off financially, economically, than most other white Americans, or not than all, but than most, they are still doing worse now than they did 20 years ago. Median income has fallen. And if that's the case, and what about the richer Jews? Well, we've already said the richer Jews, as they're becoming part of America, are not supporting only Jewish institutions. Even if they are, some of that support is going elsewhere. So you can't really continue to talk about high quality and ignore the fact that quality requires assets and support. Now, what about the matters of generation? Jews are older than the rest of America. The proportion of America is in general aging, but Jews are ahead of Americans on this one. The proportion of Jews above 50 are 8% greater than the rest of the population. These age differences between Jews and other Americans have been increasing. In 1980, 21.7, almost 22% of American whites, but only 16% of American Jews were under the age of 14. On the other end, only about 2% of the American white population, but almost 16% of the Jewish population were over 65. The 1990 data is even more striking. While the total population, the larger number of 8.1 million that is enumerated in the survey, reveals a little over 20% under the age of 15 and almost 14% over 65, which is almost identical with the American white population. When you look just at the core Jewish population, a whole different picture emerges. Here, just under 19% are under 15, while over 16.5% are over 65. That's 1/3 more elderly persons than the total population. So, Jews are older, and moreover, it's not only important that they're older, but what we find is that there are declines in generational observances. That is, that the younger you are, the less likely you are to observe Jewish life actively. Now, some people have looked at the data and they said, well, wait a minute, it's not so bad. The previous generation dropped much more Jewish activity than the current one. There's been a leveling off. Well, that might be good news, but if I were a bit cynical, I'd say, what's left to drop? That's why there's a leveling off. There's not much left to drop. There's been so much given up that, sure, the children now need not be that different from their parents because their parents made the great drop away. So yes, there are certain aspects of Jewish identity and involvement that seem to indicate that this current generation of youth isn't dropping off at all, or not as much. But I would argue not only what's left to drop off, but it may be that being more Jewish today is evidence of American multiculturalism. And it's not because the Jews are becoming more actively Jewish, but because in America it's okay. It's okay to say you're celebrating Passover, perhaps, than it was not, say, in the 50s or even into the early 60s. Now, there's also some who say that there's importance in the role of the life cycle. And it is a fact that as Jews have children, they tend to become more active. With the birth of children, they join synagogues. They're more likely to join synagogues. But, for example, if you have children later in life, as many young people have, then the effective life cycle diminishes. Number one, you have fewer children, obviously. But if you have them later in life, your life patterns are established, and you're less likely to become more actively Jewish. Moreover, alternative families, which is one of the growing phenomena in Jewish American life, alternative Jewish households don't operate according to these same rules. And alternative Jewish households is the single largest category that has been growing. It increased 100% between 1965 and 1975. It grew from 15 to 38% of the American Jewish population. What do I mean by alternative Jewish household? Single-parent families, mixed married families, unmarried families. Woody Allen is not the only Jew to live in an alternative Jewish household. In fact, by 1990, the proportion of traditional Jewish families is very small. Only 14% in the 1990 survey consisted of a married Jewish father and mother with children. So there have been declines, there have been changes. The young tend towards greater social intimacy with non-Jews. They're more likely to intermarry than their forebears. By 1989, a solid majority of American Jews were once again expressing concern about anti-Semitism in America, in part because of an increase of black Jewish hostilities, a decline in the American positive image of Israel, and the resurgence in the political influence of the Christian religious right. But younger people were far less concerned about this than elders. What about residence patterns? Of all the elements of Jewish life that seem to lead to Jewish activity and involvement and survival, Jewish residence has to score near the top. Living near or with other Jews is perhaps the best recipe for sustaining Judaism. This, of course, has conflicted with the American obsession with mobility. For Jews throughout the post-war period, and even more so during the last 20 to 30 years, moving up has meant moving out. You don't want to live where your parents have lived. You don't want to live the lifestyle that your parents have lived. And that has never been truer than during the 80s and 90s. Jews have continued to move from large centers of Jewish population, especially from the East Coast and New York. It began with a spurt during the 1970s. 83% of Jews lived on the East Coast at the beginning of 1970. Only 60% lived there at the beginning of 1980. During that period, those who moved to the West, and I'm sure you'll testify by the growth of places like the Seattle Jewish community, grew threefold to 18% of American Jewry and a similar surge in the South. This has been the area of the Sun Belt, the era of the Sun Belt and the move to the West. Nearly half the population changed their residence between 1985 and 90. I mean, the caravan is probably the best image of American Jews. They are wandering in a very real sense. The West and the South posted net gains. The Northeast and the Midwest posted losses. What has this meant? It's not just movement. It's movement, and you'll excuse me for sounding like a New Yorker now, but it's movement from a dense Jewish population to a sparse Jewish population, to a dispersed Jewish community. And that means when you are living in closer contact with non-Jews, when you are not living in as a concentrated Jewish community, the patterns of mobility suggests significant numbers of fourth-generation Jews will be living in areas of low Jewish concentration. And Jewish continuity is likely to be affected. Frankly, Jewish continuity is most pronounced in large metropolitan areas of Jewish concentration, whether they're old ones or new ones. And that's reflected most vividly in marital patterns. During the years of the 80s and the 90s, 80% or more of marriages, for example, in Baltimore or Boston or Essex and Morris County and metropolitan New Jersey, are in marriages. While in San Francisco and Dallas, where the Jews are fewer and farther between, there are only 60 and 66% of Jewish in marriages. And Denver and Phoenix are areas of relative Jewish scarcity. 61% of married Jews under 30 in Denver and Phoenix are married to non-Jewish partners. The mixed marriage rate for males outside the New York area is double that found in the New York area. So, go west, young man. It's a great idea for America. It hasn't been all that good as far as Jewish in-marriage is concerned. And this is reflected in fertility as well. Areas of high Jewish concentration have higher Jewish birth rates. 2/3, it's also reported, it's reflected even in such simple things as the symbolic religion or symbolic ethnicity I've talked about. 2/3 of New York Jews reported having a mezuzah on their doors. 57% of Jews in Phoenix have a mezuzah on their doors. Now you might say, well, so what? It's only an indication. It's only a symbol. What about outmarriage, which in a way has become the obsession of American Jewry? If we were obsessed with survival, anti-Semitism, economic discrimination, anti-Semitism and economic discrimination were the obsessions of the 50s. The obsession of the 80s and the 90s is obviously intermarriage. Intermarriage, as I'm sure you'll all agree if you think about it, is not a cause, it's a symptom. Intermarriage symbolizes, as perhaps no other indicator, the conflict between universalism and particularism, between assimilation and ethnic continuity. Intermarriage, leaving aside the religious issues, intermarriage represents a cultural drift. Let me give you one example. In the 1990 data, 37% of Jews claimed to have gone at least once to a non-Jewish service during the year. Jews are not going to the synagogue, but they are going somewhere else. In the late 1950s, Sclair and Greenblum, who were pioneers in the study of Jews, found that 43% of American Jews claimed they'd be somewhat unhappy, and 29% said they'd be very unhappy if their child married a non-Jew. In 1990, 79%, that's an overwhelming number, 79% claimed they would support or accept the marriage of their child to a non-Jew. It's not only a reality, It's a reality that American Jewry accepts and supports. To be sure, this is a two-way street. This is the example, this is the success of America. America, at least white America, at least as far as the Jews are concerned, has succeeded in integration. The Gallup poll found that over 75% of Americans approve the idea of Jews and Gentiles marrying, which is up from 59% in 1968. Is that good news or is it bad news? As an American, I think it's wonderful news. It's great news. As an American, I am proud of that kind of integration. Extraordinarily proud. Who can say that America is closed to Jews today? When you hear those numbers, you can't say that. America has opened itself to Jews. As a Jew, I'm not sure it's such good news. As a Jew, it's a very heavy price. Among those between the ages of 25 and 39, the rates of intermarriage are almost identical to those of their elder counterparts. There has been a leveling off of intermarriage. In 1990, 32% of those born Jews are not married to someone born Jewish. So there's been a leveling off, but look at the level where it's leveled off. Only 4% of those who married non-Jews converted. The rest did not. And how has this varied over time? Maybe the starkest way of talking about this is just to compare 4 decades. It was 9% before the rate of marriages taking place before 1965, 9% were intermarriages. Of marriages between 65 and 74, 25% were intermarriages. Between 74 and 84, 44% were intermarriages. And although there is some question about the data today, there's some controversy, and some suggest it's a little lower, the 1990 data suggest that since 1985, 52% of marriages in which Jews are participating are with non-Jews. That means that more Jews are marrying non-Jews than are marrying Jews. And of course, as I pointed out, we have this enormous number of non-Jews who are living within the Jewish community, within the Jewish family and household. What about identity? Well, identity is a very complicated topic. The time doesn't really allow us to go into it. Let me just say very briefly. It used to be that you could the options were either or. Either you're Jewish or you're not Jewish. Or both and. You're both Jewish and American. These terms no longer make sense for American Jewry today. Judaism is less associated, Jewish identity is less associated with a particularistic religion. Most Jews in America define themselves as a national group, an ethnic group, a culture, a Jewish heritage. In a recent Los Angeles Times survey, just so you don't think I always talk about the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, Jews were asked throughout the country, what's most important to Jewish identity? And they said, what's most important we're talking about? A commitment to social equality, religious observance, or support for Israel, or what? That was the question. What's the most important thing? 50% said the most important thing is social equality, and the rest were divided evenly among other options. Well, if that's the most important thing about being Jewish, of course it's American. Who wouldn't want to be Jewish? That's as American as apple pie. What about institutional life? Well, I've already talked ad nauseum, I think, about a Jewish education. You know the story about Jewish education. I don't think I need to express that again. It's in trouble. It requires a great deal more resources. It's not getting that support. But in general, what about Jewish institutional life? We've built all these institutions in Jewish America, and yet Jews are significantly less likely than their neighbors to be identified with religious institutions. Jewish enrollment in their own institutions is 60% of the national figure. most Americans are more active in their institutions than Jews are active in Jewish institutions. Well, if I've painted a bleak picture, let me give you one piece of really good news about Jewish life in America in the 80s and 90s, although I don't know how long it will last. And that is in the area of political influence. Even though we peaked as our proportion, Jews peaked as their proportion of America in 1927. In 1927, we were 3.6% of America. And now we're about at the lowest proportion we've been, except since the colonial period, of course. But our political influence has never been greater. So obviously, in the areas of political influence, less is more. That if you target what you do, that if you are organized, that if you have a clear political agenda, and of course you give to the right political campaigns, you can have influence in America. The political influence of Jews is particularly strong. However, that political influence is strong because Jews have been relatively limited in what they've asked for. They've asked, by and large, for support for Soviet Jewry and support for Israel and a Holocaust memorial here or there. They haven't asked for support for Jewish education. They haven't asked for support for their synagogues. So we could go on and on about the particularistic Jewish needs. Nevertheless, there's no question that political influence has grown. Whether it will continue to grow remains a question. But naturally, as the nature of Jewish life in America changes, even if Jews continue to have political influence, the question is, how will they want to exert that influence? What do they want? What will they want? If they become very much like the rest of America, then, and if social equality is what they will want, then to get the Jewish vote, you'll have to be in favor of social equality. Not so terrible. Let me just say one or two things in passing about Orthodoxy. I do this for two reasons. One is because Orthodoxy has been an area that I've spent a lot of my time studying and writing about. And the other is because many people have argued that whatever everyone else is doing, the Orthodox are keeping the fires burning. And so the Orthodox will always be there somehow. It is true that by any measure of what it means to be Jewish, Orthodox score highest. Fertility, they're highest. Concentration of Jewish residents, they live with other Jews. Israel, their connections to Israel are enormous. Of all the Jews who've even contemplated moving to Israel, the single largest proportion, 14%, come from Orthodoxy. 14%. I'm sorry, I said that wrong. 14% of American Jews contemplate the idea of Aliyah, moving to Israel. The largest group among them are Orthodox Jews. Charity, Orthodox Jews give proportionately more to Jewish charities than any other group of Jews in America, and as you can guess, they give most of their charity to Jewish causes. They have the lowest intermarriage rate. In fact, they also have the lowest divorce rate. They have more Jewish education, offer more Jewish education to their children, and so on and so forth. You could, whatever measure you choose, they're up there. But there are fewer of them, less and less of them. And they aren't so successful in holding on to their own. 25% of the people in the 1990 data who claimed to be raised, 25% of those people claimed that they were raised as Orthodox Jews. But according to the data, only 6% of American Jewry today calls itself Orthodox. Now, I think that's an undercount, because ultra-Orthodox Jews don't answer surveys, and because there are all sorts of reasons that certainly they don't answer surveys. They're not interested in that. But there are other reasons for the undercount. So let's say they're 10%. And even if we look at the data of those 6% in the 1990 figures who said that they were Orthodox, only 65% of those claim that they only buy kosher meat. So I don't know who those other 35% of the 6% are that are Orthodox. It's obviously a sliding definition. Now, here's another thing that the Orthodox ought to be worried about. And if the Orthodox ought to be worried, I'm going to argue the rest of us should be worried as well. The median income of Orthodox Jews in 1970 was almost $14,000, which in 1990 dollars, given inflation, is a little over $45,000 a year. The median income in 1990 for Orthodox Jews is $40,000 a year. That's an erosion of 10%. Everybody's doing worse, Orthodox Jews included. Orthodox Jews are still the poorest of all Jews, but their Jewish expenses are the highest of all Jews. For an Orthodox Jew, a typical Orthodox Jewish family of 5, 3 children, 2 parents, both Jewish. Their expenses include synagogue membership, day school tuition for all 3 children, possibly member in a Jewish Y, giving to a Jewish charity, Jewish summer camp. Their Jewish costs are minimally between between $18,000 to $25,000 a year, depending on the region of the country. To have that kind of Jewish expenses, you need between $80,000 and $125,000 of income a year. And they also want their kids to go to college, many of them. Not all of them, but many of them. And the best colleges, not only the state colleges. And they can only go to colleges where there is a large Jewish population, a large Orthodox concentration. And there aren't in lots of places such concentrations. So they have these large expenses, enormous expenses. And nobody's going to pay their bill for them. And they're not going to make more money. And they're not increasing their base. Their base is shrinking. It's extraordinary that they keep this commitment up, which they can't afford, but which is obviously important to them. And if they're going to have trouble sustaining the quality of their Jewish life, what about the rest? If the Orthodox Jews are in trouble in America, what about the rest of us? And so, at long last, this sort of brings me to the end of the story. And the question is the end of the story a happy story or a sad story? Is there something to tune in for? Or is this something we ought to tune out of? In a sense, all those Jews who remained in America after the end of the 60s, when Israel beckoned and offered a real alternative, reflected a kind of tacit optimism about Jewish life here. As long as Jews remain here, that optimism at least remains a tacit element of their existence. If you're a Jew in America, I guess you have to be an optimist. At least at the beginning of the 80s, 61% of American Jewry agreed that there was a bright life, a bright future for life in America. And perhaps more important, only 13% disagreed. Those who were relatively inactive in their Judaism, although proud of it, the ones I've called the Jewish heritage Jews, were optimistic that enough of what was valuable in their Jewish heritage would remain as they became inextricably bound up with America. If this was a minimal commitment, so be it. They seemed to suggest it wasn't necessary for there to be more Judaism because Judaism and Americanism were perfectly suited to each other. If not the promised land, the United States was nevertheless the land of promise for Jews and for all people. Regardless of the meager nature of their commitments and ties, the vast majority of these Jews wanted somehow to remain Jewishly connected to other Jews. And Peter, these people that you say suggest the middle is still here, I don't think it's necessarily the middle. There can be people here who are actively Jewish, and there can be Jewish heritage Jews who are here. You don't have to be in the middle to come to a lecture like this. You can be anywhere in the Jewish spectrum. You don't even have to be Jewish to come to this lecture series. Regardless of the meager nature of their commitments and ties, the vast majority of these Jews wanted somehow to remain Jewishly connected to other Jews, and I think that's good news. The question was, and remains, what the meaning of that connection was and would be. Some have argued that the debate about Jews in America is between those who argue that American Jewry and Judaism will survive, but simply in a transformed form, reconstituted in political, economic, and cultural styles that will provide new bases for cohesion and continuity. These are the transformationists. But to these transformationists, one is tempted to point out that a Jewish education that is largely trivial in its contents, a growth in the membership of more liberal Jewish denominations at the expense of those which require a greater commitment of observance and Jewish involvement, an increasing difficulty in finding both Jewish leadership and Jewish educators, a large offering of Judaica in the university, but something short of large enrollments, a diminishing density in Jewish residents, a falling number of Jewish philanthropic collections, skyrocketing intermarriage rate with a declining number of non-Jewish spouses converting to Judaism, low fertility and a declining population. Yes, that's a transformation, but it's not a very good transformation for the Jews. Jewish heritage and pride are simply not enough, even when they result in political influence and symbolic ethnic visibility. If those raised as Jews may continue to think of themselves as Jews, regardless of how they behave, this is, in the words of one observer who views Jewish life in America in pessimistic terms, who was a Stroum lecturer here, Charles Liebman, it's nothing less than a form of collective assimilation that takes place in stages. Moreover, to be simply a community of choice, Judaism and Jewishness would have no more force than Unitarianism. It must rather have the force of destiny if it is to survive. For it is a basic sociological wisdom. The community of birth is stronger than the community of choice. Jews have to feel that they have no choice but to be Jews if Judaism is not to be transformed into a faith no more grounded in meaning than, say, is Ronald Reagan's Irishness. As for the public Jewishness that renders Jewish life far more visible than in the past, and which some point to with optimism, I don't think this presages a rosy future. The Hanukkah menorahs and the Holocaust museums, the kosher food on airlines or the Israel Day parades and Jewish book fairs are not enough. Rather, as Liebman has argued, these public displays project a false image of Jewish vitality, a kind of residual Jewishness, or a hollow Judaism. To be meaningful, Jewish choices in the future will have to be less ambivalent, less ambiguous, less part-time, and more decisively at one end or other of the continuum. Those who in this last 40 years have been actively Jewish in America were certainly clear about how to connect to their fellow Jews. In a sense, though their numbers were small, they were also optimists, for they clearly believed there was nothing in America that limited their pursuit of their Jewish identity, their plumbing of their Jewish roots, or their practice of their ritual and religious life. But these active Jews have had to swim against the strong currents of assimilation and cultural drift, knowing they are always a minority and existential outsiders. Still, their conviction that in their choice to be active and involved, they could assure Jewish continuity and vitality sustained them. They believed that they, in the end, could continue to be Jewish. In a sense, only those who left America for Israel were genuine pessimists. For in their aliyah, they were saying Jewish life, however expressed or active, could not flourish in America, and that to remain a Jew, not necessarily a religious and observant Jew, to remain a Jew, one needed to be in a Jewish homeland. Increasing numbers of the actively Jewish in their attachments to Israel may be ready to accept the Israeli view. Certainly among the Orthodox, who have the highest rate of aliyah among any segment of American Jewry, who think about it more seriously than any other American Jews, and who have been sending their young there for extended stays for at least the last 10 years, suggest that among the most actively Jewish, the yearning for Israel, looms ever larger. Are the emigrants right? Are our days numbered? Will American Judaism become so transformed as to be unconnected with all that preceded it? The fact is, the American Jewish community is today overwhelmingly descendant from one major wave of immigration that lasted from the 1880s to the 1920s. As a result, the 20s, the 30s, the 40s had their most marked impact on the second generation, while the 50s, the 60s, the 70s had it on the third generation. And it's not clear what will be the shaping historical events for the fourth generation. What is clear is that the large body of Jews in America, whether transformed or not, will continue to have two faces, two hearts, and two stances. One stance is active, and the other is passive. One of those hearts beats with the rhythms of Jewish life, while its face turns ever more frequently toward Jerusalem, even though the feet underneath it seem still firmly planted in American soil. But the other face, the larger of the two, turns toward the West and America, and its heart pounds to the American beat. Its footsteps lead into American life, and Israel and Jewish tradition are but a distant melody that still echoes in the mind, sometimes louder, sometimes softer, but with a striking constancy. Whether this song will be enough in the din of American life, I cannot say for certain. And as for me, an active Jew standing here in Seattle, I can only quote the great poet Yehuda Halevi, who throughout his life longed for his return to Zion. My heart is in the east, but I am in the farthest reaches of the west. If I'm to be certain that my children and their children will continue to be actively Jewish, then the boat that brought my family here to America in 1950 has one more trip still to make. Thank you very much.